talk about today is a population of Christians, the Greek Orthodox Christians of Istanbul, native to what's now the Turkish Republic, but of course are cultural descendants of the old Byzantine Empire, of the Christian presence and culture that predates the Turkish Republic, predates the Ottoman Empire. Here at the nexus of historical memory, trauma, and cosmopolitanism is how I'm describing this. And let me first of all present a few of the basic arguments I want to make by talking about this community. Here to the left, by the way, this is an icon painted in the 1960s, the Virgin of Vlacherna, apparition of the Virgin I believe in the 8th, 9th century, guarding the walls of Constantinople. And this particular version is in a historic church in old center of Istanbul right now. So one of my major arguments by looking at this community and talking about it is that the history of the Greek Orthodox of Istanbul, or the Romi, or the Rum, Romi in Greek, the Rum in Turkish, both of which just mean Romans in English. And by that term, we mean the Byzantines. In other words, this community has referred to itself for many, many centuries since the conquest in 1453. As Byzantines, as Greek Orthodox, what we'd call in English Greek Orthodox, as descendants of the Byzantine Empire culturally and religiously as members of that faith community. The history of the Greek Orthodox of Istanbul challenges romantic imperialisms in both Islamic and Orthodox Christian historiographies. So most of my research, was discussed by Martin previously, which I appreciate the introduction, has to do with the history of theology, so the history of classical Islamic theology in Arabic, Eastern Orthodox theology in the Abbasid Pura, same era, classical Arabic, and then modern Orthodox thought and modern Islamic theology in Turkish. So I do primarily history of theology. The reason why I find this community so fascinating, I mean, I'm Eastern Orthodox myself, and so I have interest in Orthodox Muslim relations for that reason. But the reason why I find this community fascinating in particular is because I think that understanding their experience, understanding their history, challenges certain assumptions that we often have in the field of Islamic studies and in Orthodox Christian studies, specifically the tendency to romanticize empire, the tendency to argue that Muslim empires were sort of paradisical, pre-modern analogs to contemporary human rights, or in the other direction, that they were somehow dystopian hellscapes, as it were, for minority rights at the same time. And from the Orthodox Christian side of historiography, to argue that Orthodox Christian theology necessarily has to derive from imperial foundations. Most of what we believe, or most of what is analyzed when it comes to the history of Eastern Orthodox Christian theology, derives from people who did their work in the context of empire, supported by empire, the Christian empire, the Byzantine Empire. The great dogmaticians, the great theologians of the Eastern Church are all people who, even if they found themselves on the wrong side of the empire, presumed and supported a Christian imperial order, which on its own had a difficult life for minorities inside its borders. So there's a tendency, I think, in Orthodox Christian historiography to assume that the most authentic version of Orthodox identity is imperial, derives from people from an imperial context, whether it be the Byzantines, the Russians, for instance, and a tendency within Islamic studies to talk about Muslim empires in a way that sort of obscures the reality of non-Muslim populations. And so the community, the history of this community, I think helps to rebalance, helps to bring some nuance into those two fields. And also, in particular, I'm going to argue by the end that the leading edge, the leading exponents of Orthodox Christian theologies of human rights, they come from this community. They derive from the Eastern Orthodox of Istanbul, and that's not a coincidence. That's part of their experience. The way I want to talk about this is first the first part of this, I'm going to go through just a basic history of this community based on the best scholarship we have right now about them, and then go into some examples of what I call sort of these histories of theological interaction, of ways in which the Greek Orthodox of Istanbul have interacted with the Muslim culture surrounding them, in ways that are forgotten, that are not part of the broader narrative of Islamic studies history or the broader narrative of Eastern Orthodox history, And there's two categories I use to talk about this: political theologies, the ways in which um, we should rethink political theology, both in Islam and Christianity, if we do it from the perspective of those who are what I call perspective of the subjected. So we think about, in other words, we talk about both Christian and Islamic political theology. We're always talking about projects done by people in the imperial majority, basically. What was the theology of, or what were the political ideas of al-Mawardi from the Abbasid period, or of the medieval Islamic imperial examples, or from the Christian side, the legacy of Constantine, which of course is the foundation of Byzantium, and how can we deal with those political legacies? I think it's interesting to ask the question, what is the political theology of produced by the populations who are the subjects, who are not in imperial power? How do they think about politics? And what do they have to say about what a political community should look like? And then the second kind of theology or interactions of theology here that I'm interested in are a term that I take from the work of Lydia Bringerud, who is an Orthodox Christian scholar in the US, an ethnographer, who developed this term in a different context, but I encourage you to look at her work. Vernacular theologies, meaning theologies developed by everyday believers in the Orthodox Church who are faithful believers, part of this community, but they're doing theology on their own, ad hoc, if you will, to explain and talk about their lived circumstances, and they're not really in dialogue exactly with the authorities, with the hierarchy. So they produce theologies that explain their and deal with their current environment, but may or may not be approved by the formal hierarchy. And so those kinds of theologies fly very much under the radar in Orthodox Christian historiography because they're not systematized, they're not given the stamp of approval by a hierarchy, but they're used by people every day, and they tell us a lot about actual everyday lived interactions and circumstances. And finally, one point that I want to make that when I do larger, so my work now is I'm trying to do a sort of a comparative project. Um, this is not part of this presentation, but it's a much broader theoretical point that rounds out my whole argument is that this works in reverse. We should it would be great if someday someone could do a project about the reverse circumstance, which is Muslim minorities in Orthodox empires. And the most prominent example would be the Tatar Muslims of Russia and Crimea. Because if you look at their experiences, they nearly perfectly mirror Orthodox minorities in Muslim empires. They have the same difficulties, they face the same challenges, and they produce very similar theologies of human rights, actually um, around the same time period. So I want to make a point here that my broader point is comparative, is mirroring, is that the dynamics I'm talking about here are the dynamics of imperial powers and their subjects more than they are a certain faith community. You can observe these dynamics with any imperial power, whoever their subjects are. And one of the unique aspects of Orthodox Christian Muslim history is that they have both been imperial powers over one another and subjects of each other's empires for going back to the beginning of Islam for many, many, many, many centuries. Unlike the Western experience of Christian-Muslim relations, where Western Christians living in close proximity to Muslims for centuries on end is is quite rare. Not unheard of, but quite rare. And we don't have many examples of that leading all the way into modernity. But in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Eastern Europe, we have examples of this that go back century upon century upon century. So that's my broader project here. All right, so get into the topic at hand, the history of the Orthodox Christians of the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Republic. So beginning here in the 19th century, the Tanzimat era, the era of reform. I'm going to put a lot of dates and details here just so you can track, and this is being recorded, so you have the details here, and also because it helps you remember things. I mean, I don't have as memorized. This is the reigns of Abdul Majid and Abdul Aziz. This is the era of great imperial reform. Many of you are probably familiar with, but of course, the ground for this had been prepared by the previous sultans. So we're talking about 19th century reformism of the Ottoman Empire, along the same lines of broadly speaking, liberal reformism that you're getting across Europe, including in Russia, and of course in Western empires as well. A point here is that these kinds of reform movements to not only to further centralize the Ottoman imperial structure, but also provide new kinds of rights for the subjects. This was broadly supported by the intellectual class, including by Muslim religious thinkers. So the Muslim religious elite, the ulama, were broadly supportive of this agenda and developed their own theologies supporting it, which is how you lead into modern Turkish thought. As part of the things I try and talk about. But the broader populace was all the broader Muslim populace. This is quite controversial because it implied a reduction in power, a reduction in status vis-a-vis minority populations. Um, and so this falls under the category of Ottomanism, the idea that in the new imperial order, the Tanzimat, citizens will have a kind of equal citizenship under the Sultan, under a monarch, but that their rights will not be uh, pegged specifically to their religious identity. They will not have. There was an attempt in this reform era to create a structure where Muslims, where subjects had the same rights vis-a-vis the monarchy, whether they were Christian, Muslim, or otherwise. The traditional system in Muslim empires and in other empires, Orthodox, the Habsburgs, whoever, is that the ruling faith, whether it's Islam, Orthodoxy, Catholicism, whatever, members of the ruling faith have social priority. Everybody else is tolerated, but has a kind of social inferiority or precarity in different ways. Ottomanism under the Tanzimat was meant to kind of abolish this in some ways to make a new modern order where that wasn't the case. It didn't actually happen, of course. This is true for all the pre-modern imperial attempts at reform. It was not totally fulfilled, but the attempt changed Ottoman society radically, and the attempts allowed for the growth of a very powerful, thriving Greek Orthodox presence in Istanbul. So the major, again, dates here in terms of orders, the Gülhane Edict, the Hati Sharif, that should be the Gülhane Edict or whatever. The Gülhane Hati Sharif, or they're also called the Tanzimat Phenomena, the Sultanic Edict that opened the Tanzimat in 1839, and the Hati Humayun, or the Edict of Reform, the Islahat Phenomena, which sets down the idea of basic rights guaranteed to all subjects without regard to religion. And also, like I said, supported by broader Islamic theological currents of the time. These documents explicitly argue that this change is in accordance with Sharia, with the way of God, the will of God. The constitutional period is dated to 1876, called the Meshrutiyet period. But soon after this, so you've got about 4 decades of reform, 4 decades where in the middle of the 19th century, Ottoman Empire is moving toward this ideal of a kind of equal citizenship for everyone, regardless of religious faith. During that period, this allows for the growth of the power of the Greek Orthodox minority in Istanbul. But there's the famous conservative reaction that sets in under Abdul Hamid II, who rules as an absolute monarch again until 1909, and that sets into the train events that lead to the fall of the empire. All right, but during this period, the middle of the 19th, and I have a table here where I'm getting these numbers from. This allows for major economic growth in Istanbul. These social reforms allow for the growth of a Greek Orthodox bourgeoisie, which is the real ancestor of the contemporary Greek Orthodox experience in Istanbul. This citation is from Alexandrinus, the text that I'll talk about in a few slides here. But the imperial censuses from 1844 to 1857 show that most of the Greek Orthodox population of Istanbul derives from the middle of the 19th century from rural migrants to Istanbul, or at least the base of them. Also migration from the newly created Kingdom of Greece next door, former Ottoman territory. So we have, because of the economic and social status, the social mobility offered by the Tanzimat and the growth of economic, the influx of foreign capital into investment in the capital during this time. It's a huge migration of Greek Orthodox from the provinces of the empire and the neighboring Kingdom of Greece into the capital. This creates the foundation for a new Greek Orthodox Constantinopolitan elite. What I mean by new is that there had been a Greek Orthodox presence there, of course, going back to the 4th century. And the head of the Greek Orthodox Church, the Patriarch of Constantinople, had, of course, been there for many, many centuries in the Fener district, what's called Fener, in Istanbul, now in the Old City. But now new neighborhoods develop, new centers of power develop with this new bourgeoisie, this new money, especially in a place that's now called in Istanbul called Beyoğlu, which is in Old Ottoman period called Pera, across the bridge, across the Golden Horn from the Old City. So new centers of power, new social elite among the Greek Orthodox develop in this period that in some ways competes with the old Fener, with the old Ottoman Greek Orthodox elite that had been intertwined with the Sultan's governance since the 15th century. I'm going to briefly show you a quick website here to give some visuals. This is the website describing the sort of showcasing the architectural heritage, the cultural heritage of the Greek Orthodox community of Beyoğlu, the one that developed in the 19th century during this period. They just have wonderful, it's a great website, and they have fantastic photography. So I'm just going to show you some examples here. Most famous, so churches get built, whole new churches get built throughout the 19th century all over Beyoğlu, other parts of the city as well. Most of the Greek Orthodox churches in Istanbul, their buildings date from this period because they were given a new permission to renovate and rebuild structures which they had not had for many centuries. Most famous example is the Church of the Holy Trinity, right in the middle of Taksim in Beyoğlu, this sort of grand neo-Gothic, oh, pardon me, neo-Gothic, it's sort of an interesting example, a Gothic example of Greek Orthodox architecture, which is quite notable. Um, Here's the exterior of the building, beautiful dome, etc. So, it's sort of classic 19th century. It's called academic academy style iconography. So in terms of numbers here, according to the 1914 Istanbul census, this is the numbers over here from Shaw, an article by Shaw in International Journal of Middle Eastern Studies from 1979, where he summarizes these numbers. 1940 census, 1914 imperial census for Istanbul, about 500, about a half a million Muslims, a little over 200,000 Greeks, total population near a million. Alexandros, a book I'll mention here in a few slides, his estimate is that between the 1870s to the 1890s, the high point of the development of this new Greek Orthodox bourgeoisie in Istanbul, almost a quarter million Greeks in the city of Istanbul. So there's various estimates here. These are the two most common, the one from Alexandros and the one from the imperial census in 1914. This basically means that there's about a quarter of the population of the Ottoman capital at the opening of the 20th century is Greek Orthodox. So it's an enormously important community. Incidentally, as well, about 30% or another 30% or more were Armenian as well, Armenian Orthodox Christian. The Turkish population was a little over 60%. So it was a very, very diverse city, and the Greek Orthodox played a huge role economically. During the Republic, so I should also point out, I think I might forgot to put it here, but during this period as well, the largest amount of foreign capital investment was held by the Greek Orthodox in Istanbul. They were an enormously wealthy and powerful community. In the 20th century, however, the new Republican government undertakes a series of policies that are designed specifically to reduce their numbers, to force them out either by violence or by enacting very heavy discrimination that eventually makes their lives impossible in Turkey. The upshot of this is, so I'm going to summarize some of these policies. I don't want to go through lots of detail. There's a series, basically waves of discriminatory legislation that occur throughout the history of the Republic. 1920 is the most powerful example of something called the Turkification of the economy, where these wealthy business people who were Greek were simply just expelled. Their property was seized for various legal pretexts and handed over to ethnic Turks. So a kind of forcible dismantling of the economic power and wealth of this community called the Turkification of the economy in the first decade of the Republic. The infamous wealth tax, Varlık Vergisi, during World War II, which was an attempt to sort of get extra revenue from this wealthy community to make up for budget deficits in the Turkish government during the Second World War. So very, very sort of outlandish tax penalties on this community, way out of proportion to what was charged to other communities, resulted in many of them just becoming destitute. Those who couldn't pay were sent to a concentration camp in the middle of Anatolia, work camp in Anatolia. That further reduced their numbers and their power. The pogrom of September 6th to 7th in 1955, called Altı Yedi Eylül Olayları, the 6th, 7th September events, or the Septembriana in Greek, a very, very violent pogrom that resulted in the destruction of well over 1,000 homes, over 4,000 businesses, several deaths, assaults across the city on the night of late on the night of the 6th, early morning of the 7th of September in 55. The expulsions of 1964, These are the expulsions in 64, this Sürgün, the forcible expulsion of this community. So after 55, there was a sense of deep insecurity, of fear among the people who were left among this community. The population exchange has also occurred in the 1920s, which forcibly moved most of the population of Anatolia by force out of Anatolia. But Istanbul was most Greeks of Istanbul were left in place, allowed to stay. But after these events, they feel much more insecure, feel afraid of their future position in the new republic. But they don't leave in large numbers until 1964, when the again further discriminatory legislation is revived. People who previously had legal status and were allowed to stay in Istanbul after the population exchange under the terms of Lausanne, Treaty of Lausanne, they're forced out, and laws are changed to allow that to happen. So in 64 is when you get the real drop off, huge drop off in numbers among Greeks in this community. And then the final waves of departures happened in the 1970s. There's a new law in 1971 that, again, on various legal pretexts, closes many of the foundations, the communal property that helped churches and community centers, schools, hospitals, for the Greek community operate. After the Turkish invasion of Cyprus in 74, further pressure is put on local Greeks, and so they begin to leave in even more numbers. In the 80s and 90s, there were some restrictions, or there were some lifting of restrictions under administrations like Turgut Özal as an attempt to kind of redress these problems, to redress these issues and correct them, sort of relaxing some of their legal restrictions on foundations, allowing, so for instance, in 1984, the visa restrictions for Greek citizens, including those who had been expelled in 64, were relaxed so they could come back. But this was all too little too late. People had already begun to make their lives elsewhere. And so there was no mass return. So the political climate changed in the 80s and 90s, but it was too late. The community had by that point been decimated. I noticed on your schedule that you had Anna Maria Belugnolo previously. Am I right about that? Talk about, yeah, she's the real expert on this stuff. I shouldn't undermine my own authority, but she does, I mean, truly groundbreaking work on this. So I don't want to wander off into her territory here. And she gave a better summary of this than I can, anyways. So just quickly summarizing what she likely talked about, and I can't recommend her work highly enough. In the AKP period, you have leading into the AKP, their election in 01 and the AKP administration up until the present. You have in conventional history of the AKP, the current ruling party, Adalet ve Kalkınma Partisi, the Justice and Development Party in Turkey. You've got a division into the first half of their history, the second half of their history. So in the first half of their history, around 2011, 12, 13, their reformist party, they're further trying to move down the road of making life more equal and better for the Greek Orthodox, other minorities across Turkey, including Kurds, most notably. But then a reaction sets in that rolls many of those back. So there's initial sort of optimism in the early 2000s with respect to the new Turkish administration by non-Muslim minorities who vote for them in large numbers. But then, as there's an authoritarian turn after Recep Tayyip Erdogan takes control of the party around 11, 12, 13, and certainly up until the present, that fear sets in again, and they vote for opposition parties, such as the CHP and the HDP. And the AK, again, quick summary here, but the AKP's trajectory kind of reminds me of the 19th century as well, this period of liberal reformism, of trying to make things better, like the Tanzimat, and then a conservative reaction that sets in under Erdogan, not unlike Abdul Hamid. So the same kind of back and forth, the same dynamic you have of liberal reformism and then conservative retrenchment in the 19th and in the late 20th century, with the same kind of effects on non-Muslim populations in the Turkish Republic as in the Ottoman Empire. So the upshot of all this, so like I said, is about 250,000 Greek Orthodox in Istanbul at the turn of the 20th century. So somewhere depending on the number, between 20-25% of the city's population. But by the first decade of the 2000s, all the estimates that we have put them at no more than 3,000 people. And that by the way, the latest estimate I can find on this is from around 2010, 11. And at that point, people stopped making estimates. There hasn't even been an attempt to get numbers for about 15 years, probably. So it's got to be less than 2000 even by now. Most Christians under the Patriarchate of Constantinople that are Eastern Orthodox are now members of the Arab Orthodox community, which is also equally old from the eastern part of Turkey, which Biloniolo is actually I should point out, is the scholar on. She talks a lot about that community. You should, anything she writes about that is really the best source, the only source in English on the Arabic speaking Greek Orthodox of the Republic in the Ottoman period. Um, that are now there in larger numbers, and also other Orthodox in the capital, such as Russians and people living in the capital. But the actual indigenous Greek population there, the room, is radically reduced. So we're talking, so in other words, over the course of 100 years, you had a population that was 1 in 4, 1 in 5 people in Istanbul, is now about 0.01% of the current population of 15 million. And that's a very sort of generous estimate. So they went from being an extremely visible part of the history of the city, of everyday life, to being ghosts in some ways. I don't have it back there now. In Orhan Pamuk's, this is an image I think of Orhan Pamuk's famous account of his childhood in Istanbul. He describes Greek Orthodox priests as ghostly, as like ghosts of Byzantium, as sort of specters. Sort of how they appeared to him when he was a child. Because by that point, the 50s and 60s, they're radically reducing their numbers. And now the vast majority of Muslims born and raised in the Republic, especially in Istanbul, have heard about this history, but have never met somebody from that community. Whereas 100 years before, it would have been impossible not to know somebody who was Christian, since nearly half the city was Christian or Jewish by that point, 45, 40%. And in Anatolia, the devastation is even more severe, just to sort of complete the story there. There were some 2 million, and of course, the most famous example is the Armenian genocide, which obliterated the Armenian population in Anatolia beginning in 1915. 1905, pardon me, 1905. No, 15. Losing track of my dates here. But anyways, in the early 20th century, yeah, 15 during the First World War. Like again, I could have my dates wrong here. Pardon me if I do. Losing track. So there are some 2 million Greeks in Anatolia before World War One. There's now basically zero. But by 1924, about 1 million were just killed outright in the genocidal violence that just decimated the Armenians and the Syriac Orthodox as well in the further eastern parts of the country. And about 1 million just left, expelled as part of the population exchange, to where there are basically zero. There are some, I mean, you can occasionally you can find people scattered in Anatolia who are Greek from that period, but they're even fewer. And most places have precisely zero members of this community. Their churches are still there. They've been taken over. They're sitting property of a foundation, hopefully being restored in some cases, but the community is basically gone. Okay, so that's a summary of the history. What I want to do for the next 15, 20 minutes here is, and then, leave it open and talk about any questions or any interest you guys would like to talk about, um, is give a summary of some of the academic specialist analytical frames people use to talk about this history. Like, what can we take from this? How can we think about it in more precise analytical ways? And then give some examples of those theological histories that I think are very significant when we think about Orthodox Christian Islamic historiography more broadly. Um, okay, the first book I want to talk about here by Alexis Alexandris, published in 83, reprinted in 1992, I think, which is the best text in English, or one of the best texts in English that gives a historical outline here based on archival research in Greek and in Turkish. And his major thesis about the experience of the Rum, of the Romi, is that they were seen in the Republic always primarily as foreign. That prior in the Ottoman period, they had been considered indigenous, to use a term we use now. They were part of a hierarchy. They didn't have the same rights. This is very important. They did not have the same rights. They did not have the same equal legal status, except as attempted during the Tanzimat. But as was the case in pre-modern empires, they were not granted equal rights as Muslims, or as Muslims would have had. But they were seen as part of the place. They were natural. There were many of them. It would have been impossible to imagine the empire without them. Under Turkish nationalism, they become designated as foreigners, as not really belonging there, which was a new way of thinking about them, very new way of thinking about them. And his point is that this attitude of seeing them as foreign is heightened by tensions with Cyprus, or more precisely, Turkish antagonism of Cyprus leading up to the invasions in the 70s. Um, and so the fortune of the Greeks of the Republic is tied to foreign policy, is tied to the mood of the Turkish government vis-a-vis Greece, vis-a-vis the Kingdom of Greece. So when relations were good, this is his thesis, when relations were good with Greece, then the population of Greeks in Turkey and Istanbul, there was sort of an optimism toward them by the government. They were seen as sort of safe in some way. When relations were bad, they were blamed for it. They were blamed. There's a term that shows up a lot in the Turkish about these is they were treated as rehine, as hostages. They were sort of treated as like hostages of Turkish foreign policy. They were threatened if they wanted to extract concessions from the Greeks, for instance. Or I think the other word is koz, as like a bargaining chip, like a poker chip, like something that you do as a bargaining chip in foreign relations. But they were never seen as so this new identity category of the republic that is full members of the new national community had to be ethnic Turkish. They could never fit that category because they're not Turks. They're whatever they are, they're not Turks. They're Greek Orthodox primarily, and that conditions their identity as Greek, or specifically Rum, as not Greek of the peninsula of the Greek kingdom, but as Constantinopolitan Greek. And so even this is an important point that shows up in literature a lot as well. The Turkish Constitution of 23 does grant equal rights to all citizens of the Republic as Türkiye, meaning anyone who is of Turkey, anyone who is a citizen of the Republic has the same rights. So the constitutional rights are there, but in practice, discrimination has been far more common. So that's an important dynamic in this history too, is that the constitutional rights sort of spell out legal equality, but in practice, this is not what happens. And again, this is an incredibly common story in modern nation states. And so most of this community never wanted to leave because their homeland is traditionally conceptualized as the city, as Constantinople, as Istanbul. And so no one wants to leave their home. These people were not wanting to leave their home and go to Greece, where they often felt equally as outsiders, as people who could speak the language, who were part of the new Greek country as citizens, but were not from Greece. They're from the city. They're not properly speaking part of the community of the Kingdom of Greece. They trace their roots and their cultural identity to the city of Constantinople and the pluralism that they experienced there. But they were basically forced to abandon it because of the just unrelenting pressure by the Turkish government and advancing social prejudice along those lines. The next major study that we have about this community, this is originally written in French, but I'll be honest, I don't read French, so I read the Turkish version, the Turkish translation by Samim Akgünü, Türkiye Rumları, the Rum, the Greek Orthodox of Turkey, the Turkish Republic, published in 07. His major argument is that the construction of Turkishness, of the new Turkish national identity, is what's primarily responsible for this radical reduction in their numbers. That the new definition of a member of the Turkish national community as ethnic Turkish basically meant this was inevitable. He makes a very important point that non-Turkish Sunni Muslims could easily be assimilated into Turkishness, like the Cherkess, the Circassian refugees from the part of the Circassian genocide committed by the Russian Empire against Muslim mountain communities in the North Caucasus Mountains. Most famously, the Circassians, the Cherkess in Turkish, were expelled in huge numbers, I think beginning in 1860, middle of the 1860s, but throughout the late 19th century. To this day, can easily be considered Turkish because they're Muslim, and they can assimilate themselves to the Turkish identity relatively seamlessly. But this is impossible for non-Muslims. The Turkish ethnic identity is exclusively associated with Sunni Islam, and those who were not willing to just abandon their faith entirely and become, Turkish in that regard, were always going to be unassimilable under this conception of Turkish ethnic nationhood. So his important argument here that's helpful is that the national dimension here is crucial, and it specifically bars non-Muslims because other Sunni Muslims who were not Turkish ethnically were easily assimilated into this paradigm. And so he makes a sort of, and this is the subtitle here, Ulus Devlet Çağından Küresme Çağına bir azınlığın yok oluşturucu. He makes the argument that there's a there's a the process of going extinct of the Greek Orthodox of Istanbul. And he argues that this has happened, this is yok oluş, that there's a process of extinction going on here because of relentless injustice, because for economic reasons, Turkish residents have just left for the better economy when the Greek economy next door was doing better at the end of the 20th century, for greater economic opportunity, but also what he helpfully calls the genel ortam, general environment of discrimination and hostility that advances throughout the 20th century. So he makes the kind of provocative argument that this community is basically gone, that it's going to become a memory soon, and that what will be left will be memory, well, more than anything else. This book by Özgür Kaymak, in Turkish, I wish there was an English translation because it's absolutely phenomenal. It's actually an İstanbul'da azınlık olmak, to be few or to be a minority in Istanbul, Greeks, Jews, and Armenians in everyday life, is a comprehensive ethnography of the three major ethnic minorities of Istanbul: the Greeks, the Jews, and the Armenians. And she, in 2017, and she provides a number of very, very helpful framings for how to think about this, and that is one that she focused on is traumatic memory. That the communal identity of the room of the Greek Orthodox of Istanbul is formed by particularly traumatic memory, and that the passing on of the remembrance of trauma helps shape the sense of individual selves of the Greeks who still live there. She calls it duygusal miras, an emotional inheritance, that to be a member of this community in the Republic is to pass along the emotional inheritance of trauma, because all of your preceding generations experience these waves of discrimination, even violence, especially the pogrom. She mentions how the events of 55, the 6th, 7th September events, have been a major element in the inheritance of emotional trauma since then. She also used a phenomenal word, one of my favorite words in modern Turkish, birikim, which means accumulation literally, but it's often used for the specific idea of cultural accumulation, the idea that the present moment in history is composed of like layers of accumulation of historical phenomena. It's a fantastic word. That the identity of the Greek Orthodox Istanbul is an historical birikim, an historical accumulation over time that builds the present moment and is composed of different layers of experiences. The traumas of the 20th century, the sort of glory of the 19th century, and the connection to the past, to the Byzantine origins. She also makes the important point that this is what we now call in English a structural discrimination, yapısal, that we're talking about discriminatory measures that may be unconstitutional, as it were, in a literal sense, but all kinds of legal frameworks are invented structurally to enable them to keep happening. She provides a helpful outline in this text of non-Muslim history in the Republic, where there's in the very, very beginning, under the new constitution, a process of equal citizenship that it begins in the Ottoman Tanzimat period and is right at the beginning of the Republic as well. But the nationalism after the First World War sort of stops this process, arrests it, and what sets in as an ethnic nationalism that makes it impossible for that equal citizenship goal to be realized. So despite Lausanne, the promises of Lausanne, the Turkish national goal of a homogeneous nation state, this is a point that Akgünül makes as well, making it homogeneous was a priority. That homogeneity ethnically makes equality in practice impossible. In the New Republic, these communities constantly seen therefore as dangerous and disloyal, legally equal, but never practically. And this history of trauma becomes key to their own communal self identity and collective memory. I mentioned voting patterns as well. Okay, a couple more books I'll talk about here, and then I'll move to my theological point. This is by İlay Romain Ers, her description of the community that moved from Istanbul over time to settle in Athens. She describes how cosmopolitanism is a very helpful way to think about this community because they have their conception of Orthodox identity is in dialogue with Islam. that their conception of being Orthodox is being in constant dialogue with non-Orthodox, with Muslims, Armenians, and Jews. There's a kind of cosmopolitanism here attached to Istanbul, particularly. But we have to be careful to not to make this a nostalgic idea that there was some liberal paradise of the 19th century that was somehow abandoned, but that this was always a process of trying to realize an ideal that never actually materialized. So there was no liberal paradise of cosmopolitanism in the 19th century, nor was there in the Ottoman period either. But rather, this is kind of an ideal, a kind of idealized experience that speaks to their cosmopolitan identity as Orthodox vis-a-vis other relations with relation to other faiths, but we have to guard against nostalgia and sort of romanticizing that 19th century experience. And she specifically argues against Akgün's thesis that they're disappearing because she points out that it's tiny for sure, but since the early 2000s, there have been a huge efforts to revitalize the community and to culturally as well, new publishing houses, academic studies, visibility that are actually making the community culturally more visible than they have been in decades, even though their numbers are reduced, but certainly not gone or forgotten. Okay. And I'll end here with, I might skip a few of these because I'm running up against time. But now some examples of what I mean, what's important by the theological interaction. So histories of their interactions as religious communities that I think tell us something about the historiography that goes forgotten. The first of these, and these are just some examples. This is from a book by F.W. Hasluck, Hasluck, which is this two-volume compendium of shared religious practices among the Christians and the Muslims of late Ottoman period, published in the 1920s from research in the late 19th century. This documents a just late examples of a century long tradition of Orthodox Christians and Muslims sharing sacred space. This is the kind of vernacular theology I'm talking about, where everyday people, especially in villages, but also in cities, they're interacting economically, sharing business, they're business partners, they're interacting by trading with, buying, selling from each other. They're physical neighbors oftentimes. Their intermarriage happens as well. Very, very close interactions over centuries. And so they begin to share religion to some degree, not to the extent of syncretism. We're not talking about making some new faith, but sort of informally in the vernacular, designating certain sacred sites that they can share, that each side sees as sacred potentially to the other. So I'm just going to read some examples here. Again, I'm putting up the text here so it can be copied if it's of interest, but I'm just going to read some examples. So for instance, let's take a look at this. So for instance, this is in Trebizond, the Church of the Virgin of Sumela in Trebizond. I'm sorry, the icon of the Virgin in Trebizond. So this is an example of a Greek Orthodox icon in Trebizond that was visited by Muslims for healing, for divine intervention, because the local Greeks treated it that way, and over time, local Muslims treat it that way as well, and see sacred power residing in Orthodox religious objects. This obviously caused some consternation among both Greek Orthodox and Muslim clergy, if faith leaders in some cases. But this kind of visiting a church to gain power from its icons, if you're Muslim, or on the right-hand side here, say the tomb of Rumi in Konya. This is Imam Baghavi in Konya, but it was true for the tomb of Mevlana as well. Rumi, or the mosque of Ayub in Constantinople, Orthodox Christians visiting Muslim shrines in an attempt to derive sacred power, healing of disease, intercession from God for difficulty. This happened again. We have records of this going all the way back to the Abbasid period, back to the 8th, 9th centuries. Incredibly old practices, century after century of Orthodox Christians of various kinds and Muslims sort of seeing each other as potential venues for God's sacred power across these boundaries. Not converting, not bringing the two buildings together necessarily, but you can designate certain times where you can step across into someone else's shrine and use it for your own purposes. This idea of a sort of vernacular theology where people can see sacred power in someone else's tradition and try and access it, we have examples of this going up until the present day in Istanbul in particular. You have it across the Middle East as well, but this is about Istanbul. So this is a quote from Eli Romain Ers, is Diaspora of the City, the book I showed previously, quoting an older elderly Greek woman. I think her research was done in the late 90s, early 2000s. So someone who grew up in Constantinople and then had to move to Athens. She said to me that she misses the sound of the Muslim call to prayer so much that she would rush home from work in order just to hear it on Ramadan days when it was broadcast from the Turkish TV channel that she had subscribed to in satellite in her home in Athens. And quote Urs here again, there are countless stories of how they visit each other on their respective name days, so Greek Orthodox name days or religious holidays, went to churches, and she says the word here, ayazma, holy springs, so springs of water that churches would often be built around that were seen as holy by both the Greeks and the Muslims of the area, and practiced different rituals of different religious origin. So this kind of so my point here is that there's some kind of vernacular theology developed that is centuries old that says that you can, as an Orthodox Christian or as a Muslim, you can access God's power through the other in some way, through a respectful interchange with the other. It's an old idea. It was incredibly popular and common. It's certainly beyond the bounds of the hierarch's, normal way of doing things. It's not canonical by any means, but incredibly common and very frequently accommodated by local Muslim and Greek authorities. Okay. And the last modern example I'll give here before moving into my last example of theological interaction here is Muslim visitors on the right-hand side here, Muslim visitors to the Greek Orthodox monastery of St. George and Büyükada, on the largest of what are called the Prince's Islands in the Sea of Marmara, south of Istanbul. Pardon me, on St. George's Day. We're talking tens of thousands, by many estimates, of Muslims coming to this monastery to pray, to pray for healing, to pray for intervention for difficulties, men, women, and children, but often mostly Muslim women, it points out here, uncovered, I think maybe not here, but elsewhere, often uncovered Muslim women. And there's records of this going again back centuries of huge numbers of Muslims coming on St. George's Day to pray for divine help at St. George's Monastery. Let me quickly again do oops, sorry, share some images of this from a post called IFSOC. It's a photojournalism website published a few years ago. Just some images here of what this pilgrimage looks like on St. George's Day. What I called here, this is called dilek günleri, wish days, or days of intercession, asking for a wish, for dilek. Just some images I'll show and then move on to the last slide. So the crowds of pilgrims here walking up the hill in Büyükada to the monastery, the Greek Orthodox monastery. Again, mostly women who are uncovered, but I noticed here some who are. Common way to ask for this intercession, this help, to tie string in trees along the way up there. By the way, tying string on trees to ask for help from someone else's shrine, I mean, we have record of that going back a long time. That's an incredibly ancient practice, and you find it all over the world, which is sort of interesting. Here's someone selling some objects to be used for that purpose. This guy's got to be a monk, if not there, somewhere else, I'm guessing. But we have the images here of, certainly I think many Turkish women lighting candles to ask for help, for intercession. This would be the opening to the church as you're walking into the church. These are obviously Orthodox women who are venerating the icon. The headscarf here is conventional for how many Orthodox women wear inside a church. But what's interesting here too, this is a good example of what I mean. Here we have somebody who's obviously ethnic Turkish inside the church praying a Muslim prayer inside the Greek monastery. This is what I'm talking about. This is the kind of, using your own piety in a sacred space of someone else, but that you venerate in some way that is, this one image represents, I mean, centuries of this vernacular theology that goes back a very, very, very long time. Lighting candles for wishes, for similar ideas here. Again, someone looks like they're engaged in what could be cross themselves or Muslim prayer, perhaps. Okay. Now I'm going to do my very, very last point here. So the last theological dimension I'll have to skip Hagia Sophia, unfortunately, but if you want to talk about Hagia Sophia, we can do that. The last point I want to make here Political theologies. So the leading voice of Orthodox theologies, of Orthodox support of international human rights standards, the idea that Orthodox Christian thought should support global modern standards of human rights, religious liberty, rights of minorities, um, defense against state authoritarianism. The leader in this regard has long been Patriarch Bartholomew I, who himself is Rum. He's from the island of Imbros, what's now called Gökçeada in the Aegean. Born in 1940, in office since 1991. He has led global Orthodox support for international human rights norms for that entire time, and he has emerged as the major theological, consciously counterweight to the Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill, who, as many of you probably know, is a devout defender of Putin's authoritarian rule, invasion of Ukraine, and the broader Russian Orthodox push to support authoritarianism and attack Western standards of human rights, both physically and ideologically. So the great contemporary bulwark of Orthodox human rights thought comes from the room, comes from a community. The leader of this community, someone who grew up in that community, someone who's from there, and who developed his own support for human rights, I would argue, certainly in conversation with his experience as a member of a religious minority in the Republic. And then finally, Archbishop Elpidophoros, who is the Archbishop of America, the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America, who's my Archbishop as well. I attend the Greek Church here in Spartanburg. He also is from Istanbul. He's from Bakırköy, a neighborhood in the not far from the old city. Born in 67, had to leave in the mid 70s in one of those waves of people leaving that I discussed. He's the Archbishop of America and has furthered this Constantinopolitan Orthodox support for human rights in the United States. He famously marched in the Black Lives Matter marches in 1920, or 1920, so I'm sorry, 2020. Um, Supporter of democratization, both around the world, and supporter of human rights in the Greek Orthodox Church in the United States. And the last, I'll leave this here. I don't want to waste too much more of our time here. But the major sort of monument to this Orthodox support for human rights in the contemporary period, coming out of Constantinople, coming out of the Rome experience, I would argue, is a document called For the Life of the World. It's the first Orthodox theology of Orthodox theology of social thought, really produced by an Orthodox hierarch since the Moscow version in the early 2000s, produced by the Patriarch under the aegis of the Patriarch of Constantinople in 2019, global team of Orthodox theologians assembled by the Patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomew I. And a huge part of the document's argument is an explicit Orthodox defense of democratization, pluralism, liberal human rights, and in fact, a specific arguing against reverence for the Byzantine Empire, reverence for the imperialism of the Byzantines. That to me is remarkable. It represents the sort of arc where the Orthodox of the old Byzantine capital of Constantinople, Istanbul, their trajectory begins in the Christian Empire over 1,000 years ago, supporting Orthodox imperialism. And now the story brings to the present day where this old imperial capital, because I think partly rooted in their experiences of discrimination in the Republic, now the descendants of that community are now the global vanguard of Orthodox anti-imperialism and support for global human rights norms against the Orthodox imperialism of places like Moscow. This is what I mean when I say that the experience of this community can lead us into thinking about how a kind of anti-imperialism or a de-imperializing of Orthodox history and of our understanding of Islamic history as well is possible. So that's what I've got. Thank you for your attendance and for your listening. And I'm very happy to take any questions or comments.